Welcome to another deep dive. Going through all the material you sent, what really stood out is this inherent tenderness in Bruce's
Mm,
character.
Mhm.
And that just shines through, particularly when we look at his relationship with Celta, right?
Right.
And it makes me want to zero in on the moments where that really comes through.
Yeah.
And especially that image of Celta almost falling
Yeah, I know.
and his instinctive reaction.
It is striking imagery, isn't it?
Wow.
And it really does speak volumes.
Yeah. So, okay, let's start with some background, Brett.
Yeah.
We've got this really rich collection of sources on Bruce's life. His own words about his college years at Georgia Tech, his experiences volunteering at that psychiatric hospital, the very beginnings of his connection with Celta,
Yeah.
and of course that guide you shared on his formative years, his childhood. So our goal today is to really try and understand where this natural gentleness in Bruce comes from and how it shows up, especially thinking his relationship with Celta, who we know is so petite and delicate.
Right, right. And so much of that gentleness does seem to be so fundamental to who he is.
Yeah.
And so in looking at that, I think we need to start by looking at what seems to be, such a key part of his makeup, right? Which is this vow, this commitment. The themes guide talks about this, and I'm just going to quote it. Bruce's commitment. Never to be like his parents, never to lose his temper, and never to make anyone afraid of him. Wow. How significant is a childhood vow like that? When we try to understand his actions later.
It's huge.
Yeah.
It seems like he's consciously pushing back against something, right?
Right. It wasn't just a passing comment that a kid might make, right?
Yeah.
To actually articulate that and to internalize this commitment that he wouldn't repeat the patterns that he saw growing up.
Yeah.
To me, that speaks to an early level of self-awareness and this drive towards connecting with others in this very different way.
Yeah. And that idea of not wanting to instill fear, to not make people afraid, it really does seem like a key to understanding his gentle nature later on.
It really does, especially, with someone who's physically as delicate as Celta was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about avoiding negativity, right?
Right.
The guide also talks about this other side of him. He was a natural caregiver, particularly to his younger cousins. And then there's that detail about his childhood dream.
Uh-huh.
Of becoming a parent himself and offering the kind of love that he felt he missed out on. What do you think? How much do those early inclinations tell us about his nature?
I think a lot, because we're really seeing this deep-seated nurturing side to him. I mean, think about it. Dreaming of becoming a parent, specifically to give the love he didn't receive.
Right.
That goes beyond just wanting to have kids.
Right.
Like, it speaks to this core need to care for others, to support them. And then we add in the fact that he was this natural caregiver to his cousins. That wasn't something he was taught.
Right.
It seems like it was just this intrinsic way of relating to anyone younger, anyone who seemed more vulnerable.
Yeah, and speaking of vulnerability, right, the guide also touches on his sensitivity to his mother's moods. I mean, it sounds like he was hyper aware of how she was feeling, almost anticipating her moods to protect himself.
Right.
Do you think that constant vigilance could have made him more attuned to other people's vulnerabilities, maybe in a broader sense?
That's a fascinating thought.
Yeah.
It's complex. On one hand, it was born out of necessity and need to avoid conflict to keep himself safe. But on the other hand, being so attuned to those emotional shifts probably made him incredibly sensitive to the smallest cues, to the smallest shifts in other people's moods. It's almost like he developed this emotional radar, right? This ability to sense fragility or vulnerability. And, as difficult as that early experience must have been, it might have amplified this natural gentleness that we see in him, making him incredibly aware of how his actions might affect other people. And that becomes even more pronounced, I think, with someone as physically slight as Celta.
It's almost like his past prepared him in a way.
In a way.
In a way, I think so.
For this relationship. Okay, so speaking of relationships, we have to address this contrast that comes up in the material, right? His time at Georgia Tech. He talks about not feeling like a priority in his friendships there. It was like his friends had their own lives that were more important than him. How do you think that impacted his view of relationships, and how might that have made his relationship with Celta different?
That period at Georgia Tech sadly seems to have reinforced this feeling he already had,
Right.
of not being truly valued, of being on the periphery, which it echoes some of the emotional dynamics we see in his childhood, right?
Yeah.
And that sense of not being central to his friends' lives probably colored his expectations and relationships going forward. So when he met Celta and experienced a dynamic where he was undeniably a priority to her,
Right. It must have been incredibly powerful. It must have resonated so deeply. And I think that might be why we see his natural capacity for care really blossoms in that relationship. It was reciprocal. And it suggests that maybe to truly express that gentleness, he needed to feel seen, to feel valued.
Yeah, and he even says, and I'm quoting here, the truth was I didn't know what love really was.
Right.
Considering that feeling of being on the sidelines in those earlier relationships, his connection with Celta really does feel pivotal. It's like a turning point in understanding how we formed a truly tender, loving bond. So let's dig into how that bond began. We know he met her while volunteering at Georgia Regional Hospital, and she was there dealing with anorexia.
Yeah.
What can we understand from the very circumstances of their meeting?
I think the circumstances are telling. I mean, he went out of his way to make it clear to her that he wasn't approaching her in any official capacity. It wasn't part of his volunteer role.
Yeah.
And the source material mentions her smiling immediately when he said that, even before he fully explained. That suggests a natural openness to him. Yeah. An intuition, maybe, that his intention was genuine, that it wasn't clinical. It speaks to this almost instant comfort and trust.
It sounds like there was this immediate unspoken understanding.
Right.
And the relationship then progressed so quickly. Shared diary entries, daily phone calls. It wasn't long before they were expressing love for each other. That's a really rapid development, especially considering what he said about not knowing love. It seems like there's something really profound there, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, the speed and intensity of their bond, it points to something much deeper than just surface level attraction. And I think it's very possible that Celta's vulnerability, being in the hospital dealing with anorexia, it tapped into Bruce's innate nurturing qualities. His childhood vow, right? To never make anyone afraid, his desire to offer love unconditionally, that would have been so activated in the presence of someone he saw as fragile.
Yeah.
It's like their mutual vulnerability allowed for this genuine and rapid intimacy to develop. It allowed Bruce to experience and express a kind of care he hadn't known before.
And the source material gives us these beautiful glimpses into the tenderness of their relationship.
It does.
Take the picnic at the botanical gardens.
Yeah.
Bruce is talking about something that, honestly, he doesn't even find that interesting, but he looks up and sees Celta completely captivated, just beaming at him with pure delight. What does a moment like that tell us about their connection?
That moment is so revealing. On the surface, we see Celta's affection for Bruce.
Right?
But what's crucial for our focus today is the shift in Bruce's self-perception. He says that moments like that completely changed how he saw his own worth, his own value. For someone who might have carried feelings of inadequacy from his past, to receive that kind of genuine, loving attention, it must have been profoundly validating. It reinforces this sense of being worthy of care and maybe even strengthened his desire to give that care in return.
And then we get to this central image, the picture in the park. Celta, we know, is described as delicate, so physically small. I mean, she was just 4'11", maybe 70 or 80 pounds. And as they're posing for the picture, she starts to sway. And what happens next, I think, really gets to the heart of this innate gentleness we're talking about.
It does, yeah. Bruce describes his reaction as purely instinctive.
Right.
He didn't think about how to catch her. His body just moved. He caught her and then immediately offered his leg for her to sit on. And his arms are just gently supporting her. And it's important to note, it wasn't this forceful grab. It was tender.
Yeah.
It was protective, geared entirely toward making sure she felt safe and comfortable. And what's so striking is the speed and the nature of his reaction. There's no conscious thought. It reveals this deeply ingrained, almost reflexive gentleness, a protective instinct specifically triggered by her physical vulnerability.
It really does suggest something deep-rooted.
Absolutely.
Almost automatic. And then he talks about his friend's experience with abuse, right?
Yeah.
Which emphasizes that even without physical force, the intention to harm can still be there. And Bruce explicitly contrasts that with his own nature. He says the idea of hurting someone he loved was inconceivable to him. How do you see this contrast shedding light on his character?
I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
It underscores that his gentleness wasn't passive. It wasn't just an absence of aggression. It was an active orientation toward caring and non-harming. His immediate thought wasn't just about stopping the fall. It was about offering comfort and safety in the gentlest way possible. And by drawing that parallel, that contrast with this other relationship where the potential for harm was so present, it highlights the fundamental difference in Bruce's internal compass, right?
Right. Right.
This deep aversion to causing pain or fear. And that directly echoes his childhood vow. It reinforces that this is a core part of who he is.
Yeah. And the impact of this relationship on Bruce himself, it seems profound.
It really does.
He says his time with Celta brought immense joy and a sense of the possibility of love, which I had never experienced before.
Right.
That's a huge statement.
It is, and it speaks volumes about how this connection shaped his emotional landscape, how it changed his understanding of what a loving, tender relationship could be.
And then there's this other part that's really powerful. He talks about how when he was with Celta, he felt like a giant towering over the negative voices and expectations from his family.
Yes.
And it's not about physical dominance at all, especially with Celta being so petite. It's about her presence, validating his inherent worth, his strength. But it happens through this gentle, loving connection.
Exactly.
It's like her belief in him, her acceptance of his tenderness allowed him to finally overcome some of those deeply ingrained insecurities. And it's in that space that he could fully embrace this core part of himself.
I think you're spot on. It's like with her, he could finally just be.
Yeah. So, when we look back at all of this, at these moments, it paints this really vivid picture of Bruce, someone with this deep capacity for tenderness and care. And even with those past experiences where he felt overlooked, maybe even unworthy, it's his interactions with Celta, and especially that instinctive act of catching her. It's so illustrative, isn't it? It just shows that natural inclination to protect and cherish someone he saw as delicate.
It does, and it's more than just a heartwarming anecdote, right?
Right.
It's a powerful example of his innate gentleness in action. It's about who he is at his core.
Yeah. So our deep dive into Bruce's early relationships, especially his bond with Celta, it brings up this really fundamental question for our listeners. How deeply ingrained are our instincts for connection and care? And what happens when those innate tendencies find a true connection, a reciprocal connection with another person,
Right.
especially when one person is seen as particularly vulnerable?
And maybe, just maybe, exploring these nuances in Bruce's early relationships can offer a deeper understanding. What's the power of these simple, instinctive acts of tenderness? What kind of impact do they have on our sense of self and our capacity for love? I think that's something worth pondering.
I think so too. It's really fascinating stuff.
It is.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.